to make sure that we did some level playing here, and we had a discussion around what was at stake in our current political context. And so our hope is that this will prepare you all for your day on the Hill, to give general context about what's happening in Congress, and also to help facilitate the intersection, or your thinking about the intersection of our theme of protecting people, peace, and the planet. And so we are joined by policy experts this morning in these areas of immigration and refugee policy, environmental justice, and peace building. So I would like to introduce for a moment our panelists. First, we have Marie Dennis, who is the co-director of Pax Christi International's Catholic Institute for Nonviolence, founder of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and a Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace. She was president of Pax Christi International from 2007 to 2019, and worked for Maryknoll Missioners from 1989 to 2012, including 15 years as director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. Marie holds a master's degree in moral theology from Washington Theological Union, and honorary doctorates from Trinity Washington University and Alvernia University. She is a laywoman, a secular Franciscan, and author and co-author or editor of 9 books. Can we please give Marie Dennis? We then also have Avery Davis-Lamb, who serves as Executive Director of Creation Justice Ministries. Avery has a background in both ecological research and faith-based environmental organizing, studying ecology in various ecosystems and organizing faith communities across the country in support of action on environmental justice issues. He works for Sojourners and Interfaith Power and Light, and he currently serves on the board for the Center for Spirituality and Nature. Avery has a Bachelor of Arts in Biology and Sustainability from Pepperdine University, a Master's of Environmental Management and Ecosystem Science and Conservation from Duke University, and a Master's of Theological Studies from Duke Divinity School. Can we please welcome Avery? And then we have Danilo Zach, who is the Director of Policy at Church World Service. In this role, he leads the CWS policy team on strategic engagement with Congress, the administration, and state and local elected leaders to advance pro-refugee, pro-immigrant policies and neutralize harmful proposals. Danilo previously served as Assistant Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the National Immigration Forum. And before that, he conducted research with Advocates Abroad, an organization based in Greece. Danilo has a Master's of Science from the University of Oxford and a Bachelor of Arts from Yale University. May we welcome Danilo. And so I will get the conversation started. I've asked each of the panelists to open up. Our first question that we'll present to all 3 of them is if they could speak to their area of focus and give us top-line issues that Congress is or is not addressing, and share with us thoughts and reflections on what they see as most critical that we should pay attention to. And you'll see each person on this panel will be focusing on all 3 elements of our theme today. So I present that question to you all, and whomever would like to go first can be so led.
Sure, you got it. Thanks so much, Camille. Thanks to my fellow panelists. It's a gift to be with you both. Avery Davis-Lamb with Creation Justice Ministries. The bottom line of Congress's approach to environmental justice right now is systematic deregulation of bedrock environmental policies. That's really what we're seeing. That's like a few different approaches to this. Just a couple weeks ago, we saw the so-called God Squad meet. Members of the administration who met to roll back protections for the Endangered Species Act. in order to open up a section of the Gulf of Mexico to oil and gas drilling. We've seen approval of mining in Oak Flat, which is a sacred land in Arizona, sacred land to the San Carlos Apache people, in order to have copper mining to provide trace minerals for all sorts of machinery. You may be seeing a theme here. And then just over the course of the last couple of weeks, significantly ramping up attacks on management plans on public lands using the Congressional Review Act. And what this means is that lands are being opened up to mining and to drilling, lands that have been historically protected under management plans. The theme between all of these is there's a crisis abroad. We got into Iran for whatever reason that maybe Marie could enlighten us in. And there's a political crisis, and so Congress and the administration seem to think that the outlook to the political crisis is to continue to open up the public lands that belong to every single person in this country to mining and to drilling. I want to zero in on the Congressional Review Act just for a moment, because that's the most live issue right now in Congress. Who here is familiar with the boundary waters in northern Minnesota? Has anyone here paddled the boundary waters? A couple of people. So the boundary waters are the most visited wilderness area in the United States. And just last week, Congress officially opened an area just outside the boundary waters that had been protected from mining. They just reopened it for a copper sulfide mine. It's within miles of where the boundaries waters are, and you all know that water does not have any sense of boundaries, right? It doesn't matter that the mine is right outside the boundary, because that water is going to flow into the boundary waters and it's going to pollute what is both the most visited wilderness area in the United States and also one of the most beautiful and sacred places in the upper Midwest. This Congressional Review Act, the boundary waters approach here is also a template for how Congress might be approaching other management plans on public lands. So all of our public lands have management plans. Many of them were developed over years of consultation with people who live locally, with conservationists, with hunters, with fishers. A lot of them allow for sorts of extractive activities like mining or like drilling, but within limits. They were developed over years with indigenous tribes. So consultation that follows a process of engagement. What the Congressional Review Act now does is says that Congress can override those management plans and essentially nullify them with an act of Congress. This is a totally new issue. The Congressional Review Act was originally created in order to provide small businesses an outlet for some regulations that might be too burdensome. The only time it was ever used before 2017 was for an ergonomics regulation in like the early 2000s. And this is a bill that was created in the 90s, right? And so it is again an unprecedented use of this bill in a way that it was not intended to be used for, that is overruling these management plans that have been developed in collaboration with communities. So I mentioned this to you because the boundary waters issue just happened, but also this is a live issue in Congress right now that we need to be paying attention to.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Marie Dennis, and my challenge is to talk about peace, which there are so many different dimensions of this issue that are critically important, and to be honest, are not being very well attended to on Capitol Hill. I think I want to start with what has probably caught all of our attention, which is the administration's request for a $1.5 trillion budget for next year. I'll say more about that in a bit, but I think of all of the critical issues related to peace that are on the agenda now, stopping $1.5 trillion military budget would be at the top of my list. Can say a little bit about where that is going to go and who will benefit from that in a minute. Perhaps another place to look is at President Trump's national security strategy, which is a really dramatic shift from what has been a more familiar national security strategy. It emphasizes threats that they identify as migrants and drugs and crime and China. And in response to those threats, the administration's national security strategy would say that the U.S. can do almost anything to stop those threats. So we have seen the abduction of the president of Venezuela. We've seen multiple attacks on boats crossing the Caribbean and in the Pacific. We've seen election interference in Honduras. We've seen attacks on supposed drug traffickers in specific countries, including Colombia. We've seen very strong support, and the other sort of piece of this strategy emphasizes the leaning on administrations in other countries that follow the same linea, if you will, that the U.S. administration is now following. So you see support, different kinds of support for El Salvador, Argentina, Ecuador, Chile, and so on, as country after country begins to look more and more like the Trump administration here. Another issue that is critically important right now and does not get nearly enough attention is nuclear weapons. We know that there is a new nuclear arms race underway. I don't think we're taking it seriously. There are 3 treaties that are practically completely dysfunctional in terms of U.S. participation. I'll again say more about that in a bit, but we are just about to start into a review conference for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're hearing a lot about is the reason that the United States and Israel bombed Iran, went into war with Iran, is it to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons? There are several other reasons that are also being on the table. But the emphasis is on the non-proliferation, as though, and there seem to be no questions at all about why is it that now 9 countries can maintain and will be expanding their nuclear arsenals in the coming years. So nuclear weapons, again, I'll say more about that later. The war in Ukraine, the current administration, Donald Trump, came into office promising that he would end the war in Ukraine even before his inauguration, and he has not only been unable to do that, if he's even tried, but he also has been so inconsistent in what he is trying to accomplish that just as in Iran, in Ukraine, it's been extremely difficult to know where the United States stood. And I think that sort of underlying the whole question of peace in the world is also what is a growing lack of credibility on the part of the United States, U.S. policymakers. In addition to the national security strategy, the humongous $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget, the war, the nuclear growth of the nuclear arsenal, the war in Ukraine, there are also wars in many other parts of the world, in Sudan, in the DR Congo, Rwanda, in the Middle East, Palestine and beyond now. And I think what we're seeing again and again is what appears to be a transactional approach to trying to achieve an end to the war. So we hear often that there are agreements being made for mineral rights if the U.S. is going to support a particular position that would seem to move toward peace. And then I think one other element that I want to just start with is the U.S. Supplying of weapons around the world. I think we're aware of the U.S. Supplying of weapons, for example, in Ukraine, but the United States is also a major supplier of small arms and light weapons, as well as major weapon systems. So, for example, one of the greatest challenges to the ongoing violence in Haiti is the fact that U.S. weapons from the United States have been flowing to Haiti, and we seem unwilling or unable, although there have been some steps in the right direction there in Capitol Hill. We are not sufficiently aware of the fact that we are the supplier of weapons to the entire world. There have also been a number of instances, and I use the example of the sort of long-term, ongoing war, conflict, violent conflict in the Great Lakes region in Africa. So the administration made a big point and claimed great success in negotiating an agreement between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. And I think it was one of those examples where, on the one hand, people leaned towards some hope. You know, is this going to be a solution? And then recognize that either it was not truthful, what was reported, or it seems as though the response is not cognizant of the history of the conflict or the situation. So from the huge issues that have to do with peace, the war in Iran, nuclear weapons, the military budget, and so on, to the local and devastating conflicts, this administration and this Congress are not doing very much at all.
All right, hopefully this mic is working. Can folks hear me in the back? I'm getting thumbs up. All right, I want to talk a little bit about some of the policies impacting refugees and immigrants and newcomers, and some of which are live right now in Congress, some of which should be more live and aren't getting enough conversation on the Hill. And I'll talk about some of the key documentation policies where the administration is making an effort to strip people of their legal status. I'll talk about the policies shuttering humanitarian pathways for those seeking safety from overseas. But I want to start by talking about ICE. And I think we've seen some of the brutal tactics on display from ICE and Border Patrol in LA, in Chicago, in Minneapolis, in Charlotte. We've seen the so-called Kavanaugh stops, in which the administration is stopping people purely on the basis of the color of their skin, or the language they speak, along with other factors. We've seen 17, now 2 more dead last week in ICE detention this calendar year. We're on pace for by far the deadliest year in ICE detention, both in terms of total numbers, but also in terms of per capita that we've seen. We've seen all across the country. I think this is probably where folks have seen a huge impact, is the fear of going to school, of taking advantage of benefits, of attending a place of worship, because of uncertainty about what ICE might do. And that affects people who are undocumented and people who are documented, because as I'll get to, there has not been such a distinction made by this administration. But what is behind all of this is money. And that's what I want to talk about, because behind all these tactics, behind what we've seen in Minneapolis and elsewhere, behind the 3,000 arrests a day quota from Stephen Miller, is the money that Congress has allocated to this administration to conduct this mass deportation, mass detention campaign. Last year in July, Congress, through a process called budget reconciliation, which is almost intentionally complex, difficult for people to understand, moved over $150 billion to detention and deportation efforts. That's well over 10 times ICE's existing budget. And what's important about that is, of course, the sheer amount of money that's gone to ICE and CBP, but also the fact that because it happened in this pathway outside of the traditional funding or appropriation system, the annual appropriation bills, it was also allocated without guardrails. And that's incredibly important. So we have way more money than ICE and CBP or Border Patrol have ever gotten. And then we have that money distributed in effectively a slush fund without guardrails about how it should be used. And that's what's behind some of the concerning tactics that we've seen all around the country play out. And right now, and this is why I want to talk about the money, is earlier this year, the annual appropriations process came back into play. And there was a question, would we continue as normal funding ICE and CBP after they just got this massive slush fund? And the answer that a lot of members of Congress responded was no, and certainly not without the guardrails that we have seen put in place before to make sure that we're not seeing the kind of indiscriminate enforcement that we've seen over the last year. And so Democrats in Congress especially have refused to vote on any additional ICE and Border Patrol funding without some of these guardrails in place. And so the result is we got a shutdown because the Department of Homeland Security remains unfunded. It's now been 65 days. There does seem to be some bipartisan agreement around a bill that would fund DHS in all aspects except for ICE and Border Patrol. But then alongside that deal, we're seeing a number of people in leadership, Republicans leadership, the Trump administration, push forward another reconciliation bill. And this is again a second effort to try to pass something without bipartisan support that would be exclusively, again, funneling more money towards ICE and Border Patrol. So on top of the existing amount that they've received, and the current outlook looks like they're going to try to put another $65 to $75 billion towards this effort. And this is a very live issue right now. The Congress will be voting on the first steps of this process. Again, it's a complicated process. But we are in a moment in which it's really important to be pushing back, both with Democrats and encourage them to hold the line, but also with Republicans to say, how can we be sending more money to ICE and Border Patrol right now? How can we be sending $65 billion more dollars without the guardrails we want to see in place? And an example of those guardrails I think is really important, especially for this group, is something called the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act. And that's been a very live topic on Capitol Hill, how we can incorporate protections that used to be standard. Even in the first Trump administration, there was an agreement that the ICE would not conduct actions in places of worship, in places where people are accessing benefits, in schools, in hospitals. That guidance went away on January 20th of last year, and we've seen over 100 instances of ICE enforcement all across the country in some of these locations, and that's what's driving the fear that we're seeing in our communities. And so we need to see that and other guardrails be included in any conversation around additional funding for the Department of Homeland Security, for ICE, and for Border Patrol. And absent that, I think it's imperative we push back on this consideration of funneling even more towards this infrastructure of deportation and enforcement. And then just quickly, some of the other issues that maybe are less live on the Hill. I mentioned earlier the de-documentation campaigns. The administration is making an effort to strip people of the status that they arrived on legally, of their temporary protected status. There's TPS for over 350,000 Haitians right now is before the Supreme Court. The administration is making an effort to terminate those protections. People who entered through the humanitarian parole process under the Biden administration, there's been an effort to terminate those protections. Refugees who went through years of vetting and processing and arrived in the US, finally finding a safe place to call home, have had their status now under re-review or re-vetting and are subject to potentially having that status terminated. And that's an issue I think that Congress needs to talk about more, is how can we conduct oversight of the administration's efforts to de-document, to target those who are here legally, who have sought safety here. We did see tremendous success in the House last week when the House passed a bill extending temporary protected status for Haiti for 3 years. But that bill is now stalled before the Senate. So if you're talking to senators tomorrow, they need to be hearing about what you're doing about moving that piece of legislation forward. And then finally, I would just say, with respect to humanitarian pathways, and I think this is where some of the overlap is going to come into place. There's 117 million people who are displaced around the world. And that's before, that number is from UNHCR before the recent intensifying conflicts in the Middle East. Millions more have been displaced in Lebanon and Iran and elsewhere across the region. And yet we have a refugee resettlement program that has been effectively shuttered. Only South Africans, predominantly white Afrikaners, are being welcomed through that program right now, at the exclusion of all other refugees, including those who have been waiting for years in the pipeline, including those who have family members here in the U.S. waiting to welcome them. The asylum program and access to protections at the southwest border has also been almost completely shuttered. The Afghan SID program for those who supported the U.S. military and remain at risk overseas has been completely shuttered. There's a travel ban impacting predominantly African and Middle Eastern countries right now. So there's really very few pathways. And sometimes you'll hear, maybe you'll hear this tomorrow if you're meeting certain members of Congress, well, we just want people to get in line. There is no line for many of these people to come to the U.S. And that's really important to understand. I think something that Congress could talk about a little bit more.
Danilo, thank you for leading us into that next question. I think top of mind for all of us is that these three issues are not happening within a vacuum. I am reminded of Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about intersectionality and about how we are to fully address what is hindering the flourishing of humanity. It is our responsibility to open multiple lenses of the human experience. So to that end, as you have already begun, can you talk more about how these three issues are intersecting with each other, particularly in a way that we would be able to present to congressional staffers in tomorrow's meetings? You don't have to go first. I'm just saying you the microphone.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll be glad to start. I think there's two really. I want to zero in on two. There's a lot of intersections, but when it comes to climate and the environment, there's two that I want to highlight. The first is the worst thing that we can do for the environment is to go to war, and that's both on the front end of war, of the sort of extraction that is necessary to literally fuel war machines, but that's also necessary to build those war machines. I mentioned two copper mines, one outside the Boundary Waters and one outside of the right and Oak Flat. A lot of our war machines require a lot of copper, right? And that's copper that's being mined here, sent over to China to smelt, and being brought back to build war machines. And then there's, of course, the burning of the fossil fuels to fly those jets. And then there's all sorts of disruption, of course, to people and to people's livelihoods, but also to the place and to the creatures and to the land that will take thousands of years to recover if it ever recovers, right? And that's not even to mention, the nuclear issue and nuclear non-proliferation. The second thing that I want to highlight is that climate change is a threat multiplier. And so any conflict that is happening in the world already, the pressures that are associated with climate change of resource limitations, of water scarcity, of migration, people who are forced to move because the place that they have made their home is no longer habitable. All of these are now in the mix as we continue to burn the fossil fuels that are fueling our wars. Now those fossil fuels are forcing folks to move, and those movements are having all sorts of pressures that are causing global conflict. So I see those are where I see a few of the relationships.
Thank you. Those for sure, and I would add as well what is very obvious, which is that the $1.5 trillion budget that is being proposed is going to actually be robbing from funds from necessary programs that would respond to the migration crisis, would respond to the needs of the earth, and would provide for the basic needs of the people living in this country, whether it's housing or education, food security, and on and on. So that the distortion of priorities in terms of spending is one place where I think the connections are very deep. There's one other place that I would mention, and that has to do with the move of this administration away from cooperative work. So the United States has now moved back from what has been a rules-based international order that has been at least somewhat basically functional for the last 80 years or so. We have violated international law, international humanitarian law. We have exhibited a lack of respect for human rights, and certainly in relation to the people, communities who are forced to move from their homes. We have undercut the ability of multilateral cooperation to flourish. The United States has withdrawn from a long list of international bodies that were helping us to deal with exactly the major issue areas that you identified, whether it's climate or any other part of the ecological and environmental question, or it's migration. All of the issues that we deal with now are essentially multilateral issues, and we have, as a country, withdrawn from countless, the economic and social affairs departments of the United Nations, everything that has to do with children, with how children are cared for or treated in armed conflict and beyond, with the whole question of sexual violence, with the whole reality of peace building in its different dimensions. The United States has simply, we know about our withdrawal from the World Health Organization. The United States has simply pulled out of one multilateral agency after another that have been created over the last 80 years or so to help us deal with all of these issues that are essentially multilateral international issues.
I think those are excellent points and places of overlap. I think the one I would add when it comes to the refugee and migration issue is about responsibility and the weight of that responsibility when we consider those who have been displaced overseas. You know, it was mentioned our role in the ongoing violence in Haiti, for example. I think Haiti actually provides a good example. The people who are protected through temporary protected status initially were protected because of the earthquake and climate disaster, and have remained protected because it's not possible to return safely to Haiti because of some of the ongoing violence and conflict that we also played a role in. And so I think it's important to remember when we think about the growing displacement and the record displacement around the world and the record refugee movement around the world, the US has played a very significant part, whether it's through contributing to some of these conflicts or failing to play our part in resolving them, or whether it's because of our participation in the changing climate and the increasing number of people who arrive at the US-Mexico border and say they're fleeing violence, say they're fleeing persecution, and say that in many instances that persecution and violence has been driven because of climate change and disaster and people being forced to flee their homes and being internally displaced within their country and some of the chaos that creates. And so I think it's really important when we're considering those who have been displaced overseas and we haven't taken enough steps to protect them and support them and ensure a path to safety, and those who are here and can't return home because of fear of ongoing violence or fear of a home that no longer exists in the same way because of the changing climate and environment. So I think that responsibility that we hold because of these issues towards those who have been displaced is really important and a key place to apply.
Okay, so I want to note that we will move into a question and answer period after this set of questions. So if you are able, be sure to write your questions down, and I'll be sure to come in and we can join in conversation with the panelists here. We are people of faith, and so we mourn not without hope. The question that I have for you all is if you could provide for us where you're seeing impact, where you are seeing progress be made by advocates on these issues, and perhaps what is providing hope for you as we continue on these very heavy journeys. This work is heavy, I don't want us to lose sight of that, but hopefully you all have examples of hope that we can carry with us.
There's two stories that I want to share just briefly to close here. The first comes from southern Texas, around Big Bend National Park. The border wall was proposed to be built through Big Bend National Park, but when local authorities heard about those plans, there was a real bipartisan collaboration between Democrats, but also some of the most conservative Republicans you can imagine in South Texas, who resisted building the border wall there because of their connection to that place and how much they cared about protecting that land. And so I think there is still some possibility for bipartisan resistance, right? There are still some unlikely allies out there, and it takes a little bit of work to find and to organize to work with them, but they're still out there. The second one comes from an area off the coast of the Southeast called the Blake Plateau. The Blake Plateau was recently discovered to be the oldest, deepest set of deep sea corals in all of the world. And it's on U.S. waters off the coast of Georgia, right? The oldest, deepest corals in the world off the coast of Georgia. There have been proposals to do deep sea mining in that place, and it's highly at risk. We've been talking about mining a lot right here, and deep sea mining is sort of the next frontier of where mining is going to happen. As if the land isn't enough, we need to go to the bottom of the ocean, right, to get our trace minerals. But this is a story of hope because very recently, I think within the last month, the Graves Reef Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council, which is very close to Blake Plateau, passed a resolution to consider adding portions of the Blake Plateau to the Graves Reef National Marine Sanctuary. This is a section of NOAA, this is a part of the federal government, but it's very local, and it's led by local leaders who are still finding ways within this federal agency to protect this land from mining. I'll finish also by saying that Blake Plateau is significant not just because of ecological significance, but it's significant to the Golden Geechee folk who are down there. It is very culturally significant to how they engage in their practices.
It is good to identify some signs of hope, and there are many. I guess what I would like to highlight is not yet as relevant congressionally as I think it is at a more global level. Bishop Royster earlier today challenged us to imagine a new way of being. And I think one of the greatest signs of hope right now is that there is a tremendous hunger for a new way of being. And people are beginning to recognize that in connection with a tremendously increased interest in nonviolence. What is nonviolence? And most especially in different faith traditions, obviously nonviolence carries different levels of meaning and depth. And in the Christian tradition, I think we are beginning to pay attention in a way that too often we have not done so. So in relation, for example, to the war, I think in relation to both of the other issue areas, there has been a tremendous outpouring of popular resistance and non-cooperation to policies that were just over the top outrageous. Sometimes that popular resistance, or very often that popular resistance, needs to precede policy change. The two need to accompany each other. So we need to be both visible in our non-cooperation with unjust policies and practices, or our resistance to them, even as we try to move the congressional or other policy-making circles. I think that what we're seeing, not only in this country, but around the world, is a fascinating look at what used to evoke a kind of pat on the head. People would say, well, nonviolence is nice, but it's really too idealistic, or it's not practical. And what we know now is that nonviolence is much more effective than violence, even in accomplishing dramatic changes, government changes, and so on. And I think we're noticing nonviolent action that is different in different contexts, and yet extremely important as we try to imagine a way forward that is a world at peace. One example of that, I think, is in the decision of many migrants to move on, to leave home, even when it's forced. Sometimes, very often, that is a very courageous decision, and it is absolutely nonviolent. And if you follow the migrant stream sort of across, even contexts where there is a lot of violence, what people talk about are the nonviolent responses to their passing through that they encounter all the way. A short while ago, we hosted just a online roundtable with communities that were both migrants and communities welcoming or sort of on migrant routes in different parts of the world. And repeatedly people talked about the gestures, the nonviolent gestures of welcome, hospitality, and support that they received, often from other migrants. So I believe that the greatest signs of hope, and I think this is very much true in terms of the war in Iran and beyond, in which we are now engaged, that there's clearly a resistance that is palpable in our country. It's a shift that is very significant, and I find that very hopeful. As a Catholic, I am very happy to have Pope Leo clearly speaking out and saying, I am not afraid, I will fight. And I'm also encouraged to see U.S. Catholic leaders following many other religious leaders in speaking out with courage about the insanity of our failure to build a more peaceful world. So I see a lot of hope.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I think when I think of what gives me hope, I start with something a little bit more abstract, which is there's a long, long history in this country of anti-immigrant, xenophobic rhetoric, efforts, legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Immigration Reform Act in the 1920s, intern of Japanese people. There's so much there that is a part of our history. And at the same time, there's a long and equally deep-rooted history of welcome. And I see the work that we're doing now as part of that really deeply American fight, deeply American conversation, and to push to see that legacy of welcome overcome what has been a really deep-rooted history of xenophobia as well. And so we're part of that long fight. And sometimes that perspective gives me some hope in times when it feels like we're losing that fight. But there's also very concrete moments of hope, and you mentioned some of them. I mean, the response we've seen, especially this year, to some of the tactics targeting immigrants and newcomers in this country has been unlike anything I've seen doing this work. What we saw in Minnesota, what we're seeing across the country, what has brought many folks here today, and what's brought so many people to the Hill. When I have conversations on the Hill with members of Congress and their immigration staffers, the tone is totally different. They're not hearing as much anymore from the constituents who are expressing xenophobia or concern about the southwest border and immigrants in their communities. They're hearing from people like all of you now, much more, and both Republicans and Democrats. They're hearing about concerns around ISIS tactics, concerns around the treatment of immigrants and newcomers. And that has changed the conversation on the Hill. There's a reason that no more dollars now are being directed to ICE and Border Patrol. There's a reason now that the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act has gone from a messaging bill, we call it, where we're just trying to build support for an issue, to the center of the debate, the center of the conversation on the Hill. There's a reason why TPS for Haiti, there's legislation that passed the House, as I mentioned. That would never have happened even last year. And so there are real signs of hope right here in DC on Capitol Hill of perspectives changing on this issue. And again, I think that speaks to, again, this long legacy of welcome in this country that we need to draw forth and bring to the fore more and more in our conversations. And I'm seeing that happen in real time. I think it's really powerful. And of course, that's on Capitol Hill, but even more powerful is the work people are doing in their communities to protect people and stand up for people. And we have seen that be effective. ICE has largely left Minneapolis. Christy Noem is no longer at the head of the Department of Homeland Security. So there have been real results, although I think there's so much more work to do.
I just want to add one word that I should have said before, which is that in addition to inspiring responses all over the country, especially in local communities, we also are in partnership with people around the world who are responding locally in their communities to the very issues that we're trying to deal with here. So, for example, across, really around the world, very much in Latin America and across Africa, in the Philippines and elsewhere, local communities are holding to account mining companies that are destroying their water, destroying their land, and they are doing it with great courage and great wisdom, and often at great cost. But I think we are even there at a time when we are one. This world together is trying to build something new.
Okay, let us open up for a question and answer period. We have a few minutes to take maybe 2 or 3 questions from you all. Is there one?
Round questions, anyone? Clarifying questions? Bishop, Trimble, come on down.
At least get it started. There's a little talk about when bombs drop, children die. And the number of children that are actually in detention, in cages. Some years ago, I was on the southern border with dealing with immigration. We actually went to see a detention center. If you've ever been to one and seen children in cages, it's hard to get that out of your mind. It's been a little conversation about how much these policies have impacted children. All of the things you talked about across the globe, including our withdrawal from all of the United Nations committees. You mentioned a few of those, including the reduction or almost elimination of USAID dollars. And so millions of people die every year. People don't know this, from tuberculosis, which we never talk about here in the U.S. because people don't have tuberculosis. But all of the decisions that were made and those that continue to be made impact, of course, impact all of us, but are impacting children at an exponentially harmful way. And something Bishop Royce mentioned that we haven't talked about is the thread of racism through all of this. Everything you talked about, the threat of racism. And so, any comments about any of those two things?
Let's see, we probably only have time for one round of questions, so are there any other questions that folks have before the panelists respond? Brian, back.
Thank you, panelists. You all have done such a wonderful job preparing us for our visits tomorrow. I also realize that we have folks that are going to be going home to all of their places, looking to bring some of that wisdom with them there. Danilo, you were one of the very first people that I heard from a great big national and global platform say that focusing hyper-local is going to be part of our work as church, and it's actually part of what we do really well as church. And so I wonder if there is a word of encouragement or a call to action that you all can share with us that we might be able to bring back to our local communities too.
We've got some more questions about one right here in the corner, so let's make them short.
And along with that, and thank you very much for what you have shared with us. How about building some intersectionality between the different things and causes that we are affirming in these days? How can we relate the different struggles, the different themes into maybe a common way of seeing values-based, justice-seeking fight and alternatives that we have been receiving into the messages that we have been receiving from the preachers. Thank you.
That was my colleague Luis Rivera Acosta from Disciples, and now Bahati.
Yes, Bahati from African Living Justice Network. Regarding the issue of violence, I'm wondering whether it is a Trump problem or an American problem. When you look back, where we come from, different administrations, the sponsorship of violence, how can we really make the right analysis so we can apply the right remedy? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll let the panelists respond to any or all of us, one or more of those questions, knowing that we are going to be breaking up into some workshop times where some of these same topics will be discussed. So, what responses do you have?
Maybe I'll just say a few words. What you all said, what you all raised are critical issues. We so rarely hear what the consequences of the image that you initially spoke about was the children under the bombs. And I think that is both literally true and it is figuratively true with many of the policies that we are now seeing played out. Both the impact of children and the thread of racism that permeates so much of what we're seeing. I want to say just a little bit about both the local communities and the violence. We really have seen in this country in the last few years a tremendous interest in understanding how nonviolence works and how to use it. As you know well, there are trainings going on in places of worship, in community centers, in universities, in schools that help us understand how do we communicate nonviolently, how do we de-escalate situations where there's a growing sense that violence is going to break out. What would be alternatives in the letter signed by interfaith leaders responding to the budget proposal? There is a great line that calls for investment in alternatives to militarism. They're real. We need to learn how we can get along with each other, both domestically and internationally, without using violence. And I believe that it is about skills. It's learning how we act with using the tools of nonviolence. It's imagining other ways that can interrupt violence, can prevent violence, can help us heal from violence. But I believe it is also learning that nonviolence is a spirituality and a way of life, as well as a set of proven effective tools for dealing with violence at different levels. So I think I can take it in all of the directions, whether it's how our way of life, our policies affect our children, the cross-cutting reality of racism in our society, the way we express violence that is both direct and also the violence of racism, the violence of deep economic injustice, and on, whatever is harming people's lives. We need to pay attention to what would be a whole new way of life if we were to imagine a way forward that was nonviolent. And I think we have a lot of work to do. One sign of great hope to me was that, you know this figure, I'm sure, that there were 130,000 people who signed up to participate in a webinar on nonviolence, a training on nonviolence, a kind of ordinary training on nonviolence by Maria Stephan, who is a great trainer, you know. I think almost 80,000 people actually participated. That's a sign of hope.
I just want to pick up quickly on the thread of racism that you raised and the impact on children. I think, I mentioned some of the racial profiling that we're seeing that ICE is doing. I also mentioned the current state of the refugee program, where we have, I think, around 4,000 refugees have entered so far this fiscal year, from October till today. 3,996 have been from South Africa, the vast majority white African. And so Church of Service recently amended our litigation against the ongoing refugee ban to focus on that exclusion, that racial animus that's present in our choices about who we're welcoming to the U.S. There is one additional plaintiff who we've added to that case, who is a mother from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who fled with her family and lived for years in Burundi, where they went through the years-long process that makes up the refugee resettlement program. I mean, people go through 5-10 years of that interview screening. In that process, she was separated from her child. So she was resettled, but her child, her son, who's now 9 years old, was left behind. His flight was scheduled to come to the U.S. This 9-year-old boy was scheduled to come to the U.S. in February of last year, a month after the ban went into place. As these South Africans have entered, the lawyer for the family asked the administration, why can't this child have access to the exceptions that you're providing to the South Africans? And she was told that the exception program isn't for them. And I think that is an example of that threat of racism that's running through really all these different issues. And certainly in the immigration refugee context, I mentioned the travel bans are predominantly impacting African and Middle Eastern countries. So I think that's really important. Quickly on the impact to children, they too have been targeted, maybe disproportionately even. 50% of refugees around the world are children. There's a number of unaccompanied children who arrived at the border. They're supposed to be placed into special care of the Department of Health and Human Services and quickly reunited with family. 90+% of unaccompanied children actually have family in the US. They just need to be reunited. The Trump administration has at first delayed that reunification, and then last fall almost completely halted the release of those children to their families. So many children have been stuck in custody for months and months. The Family Detention Center in Dilley, Texas remains open. There are children who have been detained there for over 6 months now. So I hope to get to some other questions, but I just wanted to make those 2 points based on the question.
I'll address Brian's question about what's the thing from here. And first I'll do that by ending my response about hope earlier, which is the place that I find hope is when I go into the land and when I experience the face of God we're talking about politics here, we're talking about this political crisis that we find ourselves in. But the root of that political crisis is one of disconnection, certainly disconnection from people, but also disconnection from the land. And I think that maybe the word that the folks who are gathered here today need is go to the land. Because there we find